Thank you. Okay, once again, thank you very much for joining us this morning. We're excited to be here. And Donovan and the team, thank you for inviting us. I just want to mention one thing. This workshop or presentation is normally a sort of a 9 to 1 o'clock presentation. So I am condensing things this morning. So there will be quite a number of slides that I will go through very, very quickly, or I might even skip over. But don't worry, you don't have to take any notes, because everything that we're going to be talking about this morning, as Donovan mentioned just now, we will send you a copy of this PowerPoint presentation. And of course, if you miss something and you do have a question, you're more than welcome to pop a question through to us. We either deal with it in the question and answer session. If we don't get to it, we will, of course, deal with it after the session and send you an update. So once again, thank you for your time. And yes, just sit back and hopefully enjoy what we've got to tell you. Right, I'm going to move over to the PowerPoint presentation now, so just give me a second. Right, I'm assuming that you can all see that. So once again, a big welcome from our side. What we're going to be looking at this morning, sorry guys, I just don't seem to be able to get this thing. Oh, there we go. Okay, so very quickly, budget speech. I just want to talk to you about some of the considerations government had on their plate in preparing for this budget speech. I just want to have a look at some of the issues and implications on the table that, as I say, they had to take into consideration in putting together the numbers and the changes and the tax changes, etc. Then what we'll do is we'll have a look at the actual payroll side of things. What does all this mean from a payroll perspective? What are the things that will impact employees and employers? And what you should consider obviously doing in your payroll systems. We'll have a quick break for about 10 minutes or so. You can grab a coffee or a water, a leg stretch, and then we'll carry on with some of the other more important things that have happened in the life of SARS over the last year, particularly with some of the procedural changes, some of their thinking around some new changes in terms of the way we do things. We'll have a quick look at some of the key items that came out of the tax law amendments bill and how they impact us from a payroll perspective. And then what I have done, which we won't get to this morning, is at the end of this presentation, I've added in a whole lot of information about other legislative items, things like what's happening with UIF and COIDA and the Basic Conditions of Employment Act. Those you can read and go through, as I say, after this morning's session. Okay, so again, don't worry about making notes. We will send you a copy of this PowerPoint presentation after the webinar. Okay, so let's have a quick look at some of the issues that were facing government when they were trying to put this together. So first of all, from an economic perspective, governments had to consider what was their ability to generate income and at the same time promote growth. And as you would know, we're in a pretty much a non-performing economy, so you can't really tax your way through to growth. There's just too many risks around this. We are faced with this fight or flight syndrome at the moment, where taxpayers, both individuals and corporates, are looking at what's happening and saying, well, do we invest? Don't we invest? Do we hang on for a while? What do we do? And sadly, there are a lot of taxpayers out there that are kind of running out of fight at the moment. Again, they've put the brakes on everything they were considering doing in South Africa. And of course, if the economy is not performing, individuals and companies are going to find alternative ways of making money. Sadly, through tax evasion. I'll talk about what SARS is doing around that a little bit later on. And of course, many individuals as well as companies are actually looking offshore to restructure their affairs and to look at business ventures, which is a sad state of affairs, but it's something that government does have to take into consideration when putting this budget speech together. The other things that they could have done is they could look at treaties and tariffs and just have a look at what they could renegotiate there, or increase, decrease, change, whatever. But you've seen what's happening in the US at the moment with all that, those activities. It's having a pretty much devastating effect on a lot of countries. So I don't think from a South African perspective, doing these kind of things would actually work. And of course, what tends to happen when you play around with these treaties and that, the consequence or the adverse consequence is that you end up with double taxation. And again, you find that individuals and companies start abusing the tax system, which of course government, that's the last thing that they need right now. And then of course we have inflation, which we all know is a killer. Officially, it was about 4.5%, 4.6% last year. Most increases were around the 5 to 5.5%. And as you all know, so many individuals and people out there are even battling to come out on this. Costs are getting a lot higher, and of course, versus the lower income, particularly given the fact that the tax tables for individuals didn't change last year as well. It kind of catches up to you over a period of time. So this is not sustainable. It's very much like the frog in boiling water. You don't realize what's happening to you until one day you wake up and you think, gee, man, how did I get into this situation? The costs have, really run away with me, and I'm just not getting enough income and to balance that out. So that's something that they also have to be aware of. In terms of investment in infrastructure, one of the ways that government obviously can create new jobs and they can, sort of get people excited again is to invest in new infrastructure. We have these SOEs, which we know are very expensive and are very risky, and just throwing money at that, we know is not really the right thing to do until we can get all of this under control. And in some cases, sadly, the money is available to them, but there's just been so much underspending, and it's really just due to various levels of incompetence, and as such, there's been no progress. So the question is often, why the need for more tax revenue when we don't spend what we have, and what we give the some of these entities ends up not being spent, just ends up back in the coffers of government. So that is a real harsh reality. The feeling is that these public-private partnerships are definitely the way to go. But again, the question is there a real will? There's not much motivation to do that. And of course, the concern is from many quarters is that there's going to be too many eyeballs on these sort of ventures. When you've got private enterprise looking at these projects, they have a very different view than government individuals. So this is something that we will eventually get over, but right now it doesn't seem to be a huge amount of appetite. And sadly, there are some very successful public-private partnerships that we've experienced over the last couple of years. So again, it is the way to go, but at the moment there's not too much motivation, to go this route. And one of the opinions within certain quarters of government is that these initiatives should now be driven and overseen by Treasury and not by the individual companies or departments that the money is actually sent through to, which does make a lot of sense. But as you can well imagine, there are a lot of digging in of heels around doing this. We often hear about this township economy, and everyone's talking about this. There's a lot of employment that happens in the townships. There's a lot of revenue that gets generated. Again, it's debatable because we're not talking about big companies here. We're not talking about massive amounts of money. But somehow a government need to consider how do these individuals actually get brought into the tax net. And as you can well imagine, this is not an easy task. The other challenge facing government is that there are a number of individuals, a number of employees that are getting close to retirement, and government has been considering for a while now to put these individuals on early retirement. They did budget about 11 billion for this. And remember, this is not something that has just suddenly happened. This is something that was agreed to and discussed prior to the formation of the Government of National Unity. And the interesting thing here is, if they spend this 11 billion on those retirement package, as usual, SARS is going to win because two things happen. Number one, those payments are going to get taxed. And number two, before they can get taxed, SARS will obviously take its share. So if any of these individuals owe SARS money by way of penalties or admin penalties or outstanding taxes, all of that gets collected before the amounts actually get paid out. So this is potentially a win for SARS. But on the flip side of that is you get rid of all of these people, and you need to replace them somehow. So the idea was to bring in a whole lot of younger workers, but it's not as easy as it seems because there needs to be a recruitment process. They need to be trained. They're not just going to walk into these positions and be productive literally from day one. So there's going to be a loss of productivity, and of course there is a cost to employ all of these individuals. So the question faced with government is, on the one hand, if you retire off all of these individuals, what's the real cost going to be to replace them? And do we replace all of them? And what the cost is going to be? So from a a savings perspective, is there really going to be a substantial saving? Wealth tax, we know that this has been spoken about for a while. It is very much under the spotlight. There's various political parties that have been calling for this. So again, SARS and Treasury have really started the process over the last couple of years of collating this information, tracking who these individuals are, analyzing all the data, and trying to figure out how do you actually implement something like this. But if you're looking for a quick win, putting in a wealth tax is not the way to go. Very simply because from a legislative point of view, it is going to take a while for these changes to take place. And of course, to get them implemented, by which time all the smart people have already started thinking creatively as to how to move their wealth around, how to spread their wealth around, and how to move things offshore. So this is not something that's going to happen overnight, and I think they're pretty much aware of that. And then if you look at the individual tax tables, the question facing them was, what do we do in terms of adjusting the tax tables? Last year, we saw the tax tables remain as is. For this coming year, what was on the table was how do we adjust these bands, in particular for the lower end, because that's where the most impact actually is. And again, bracket creep has crept in, so already you have so many of these individuals out of pocket. They did have potential to adjust the various bands. They could have adjusted the top brands a lot sort of less than the bottom end of the earnings scales, and thereby giving some benefit back to the poorer folk out there. And when they postponed the budget speech, they'd already put some new tax tables together that pretty much dealt with this. But of course, when the second budget speech happened, this was all off the table, which we'll talk about just now. And in terms of our top rate, already high in relation to other countries, but interesting enough, they could have raised about 3 billion through these tables by adjusting them slightly, which they didn't do. Okay, in terms of company tax, we're already sitting at 27%, again, high in comparison to most other countries. There's dividends tax that gets paid. We're pretty much maxed out on that, so you can't really tamper with us. Company tax, dividend and dividends tax combined, for all of you out there that are in this sort of industry, you'll know that it equates to about 43% in total for an individual who's starting a business and wants to get his money out. So what you're tending to find now is because of this high tax, a lot of individuals are converting dividends and profits into salaries and bonuses and doing creative things with us, as I say, to pay less tax. So doing this or fiddling with company tax is really going to be a disincentive. Your international, your local companies, that are going to look for more tax-friendly regimes, to apply their trade and to put up their factories and to operate. So those planning investment in South Africa will reconsider, and obviously they will look at other, as I say, more tax-friendly regimes for that. And then VAT, I mean, this has really been the issue on the table over the last couple of weeks. We are still, interesting enough, low in terms of most countries, but those citizens in other countries get a lot more for their taxes. So even though VAT is very high, they don't have to invest in things like we do, private security and additional healthcare, etc. So they get a lot more for the money. That's why in those other countries, VAT is high, and you don't have citizens that are digging the heels in it and not wanting to pay this VAT. So it is a quick win because it's a consumption-based tax. So if you really want to collect money literally overnight, just up the VAT rate, and literally from the next day you start collecting more money. But sadly, it does impact the poor, and it does impact them severely. So to get around that, they need to look at zero rating a couple of other foodstuffs and maybe even some other items. So that's one of the things they did have to look at. And then, of course, an increase in the social grant. So if you increase VAT and you increase the social grant, you kind of compensate, for that. And the idea is hopefully to end up with a bit of a sort of zero net effect. So that was also a challenge for them. So what are the options? So defining the problem is simple, and we spend more than we actually get in it. And for those of you that are in the accounting business out there, you know exactly what you do in this scenario in a traditional private business. The first thing you look at is reducing operational costs or any capital expenditure that you were going to get involved with, you put that on hold. But this is going to really have a massive set of political challenges and backlash if you do this. And just purely as for information purposes, we now have 2.1 million employees in government, and that has gone up by a few 100,000 from about 4 years ago. So this is a massive problem for them. The other thing you can do is borrow money, and we're pretty much maxed out on this one. And here's an interesting fact: we owe 6 trillion to other people, and it's costing us 1.2 billion per day to service this debt. I mean, this is massive. And again, it is unsustainable. So what do? You go out there and you try and collect more money. And where do you get it from? From individuals and companies. And again, you can't really do this to such an extent because it's going to have too many negative consequences. And how do you get this money? Well, you increase taxes or you increase collection efficiency, which of course is the job of SARS, which, by the way, they're actually getting quite good at these days. It's going to require obviously additional resources and additional skills development. And time is not on SARS' side. You know, they're sitting with 800 billion in outstanding taxes. These are taxes that have been assessed that have just not been collected. So no wonder Treasury and SARS are really having a go at each other at the moment. You know, on the one hand, we need the money. On the other hand, they're looking at SARS saying, why didn't you collect this? And SARS is saying, well, give me the money to increase my capacity and to increase my resources, and hopefully I can collect some of this. So that was just a couple of things that they had to consider in putting this budget together. So let's now have a look at the actual budget speech itself, the postponed one, the real one. Okay, so first of all, what we always look at is, you know, how much money comes in and how much money goes out and where does it go. So on the left-hand side, you can see what the estimated spending is going to be, or the budgeted spending for the year. And on the right-hand side, you can see what the revenue is going to be. And again, you can see personal taxes at the top of the pile there. And if you look at the bottom line there of both of those, I mean, it's very clear to see that there is a shortfall. You know, anybody can see that. And of course, there is a challenge in how do you plug that. But the interesting thing here is just look at this number here, debt servicing. That is massive. It's the second highest expense item in all of the areas of expenditure within government. It's massive. So that has to get under control somehow. So in terms of economic growth, what they're saying or what they're aiming for is that for the coming year, we're looking at 1.9%. And the following year, we're going to go down to 1.75%, and then we're going to go back up again. And investors don't like this. They like something a lot more steady. And again, as soon as that budget speech came out, I don't know if you noticed, but a lot of the exchange rates changed against us. So again, people are considering moving money. The rates have changed. And again, as I said, this is not a healthy situation to be in. One of the things that really jumped out at me, and I really thought I must tell you about this, and that is, it came out of the budget speech itself. It says, the medium-term growth will be underpinned by household consumption on the back of rising purchasing power, moderate employment recovery, and wealth gains. I mean, or what are you smoking there? You know, where's this rising purchasing power? And again, we look at the employment rate in this country, and where's that recovery? And again, wealth gains. I mean, if there's no money being you know, put into the hands of citizens, how are they going to, you know, gain more wealth? And those that have already got the wealth, they're obviously going to move it somewhere. So the big ask to achieve these numbers through all of this is, how do you get debt under control? And there seems to be a plan. Again, it remains to be seen whether this is going to be successful or not, but there very definitely is a plan in place to try and get debt under control. I think they're going to, again, you know, have a huge backlash around this because of the areas that they are considering actually cutting. And then one of the big things that happened and was mentioned in the budget speech is the two-pot retirement mechanism that was recently put in place. This was a massive win for SARS because if you think about it, SARS have been chasing down taxpayers for many years in terms of outstanding taxes and penalties, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, with so many people that were out there wanting to withdraw some money from their retirement mechanism. Remember, SARS got the first bite of this cherry. So you had to get a tax directive from SARS. SARS said, okay, you can get your money, but remember, you owe us some money, which we're going to take off the amount that you're going to get paid out, and any other penalties must be settled as well. So interestingly enough, SARS, as I say, was a very, very big win for them. Then the other thing that was mentioned is in terms of our SOEs, the wording was no more free rides, and they are talking now of opening up various initiatives to public-private partnerships, which is a good thing if you can get them to work. The other thing is in terms of infrastructure spend, if you're allocating, which there are, $1 trillion over the next 3 years, it's good news because it does create potentially new jobs, which of course, when there are new jobs, it leads to more tax at individual levels. So from a personal income tax and VAT, etc. So whatever they spend on infrastructure, if they're creating new jobs and they've got new individuals coming into the tax net, they're getting some of that back anyway via the tax system in some way or another. And the same goes for companies. If these projects are outsourced to various companies, the companies grow, there's a potential for more employment there, it leads to more company tax, VAT, dividends, etc. So all in all, if you put this $1 trillion into infrastructure development over the next sort of 3 years, and you do it properly, and it's got the right set of eyeballs on it, and you've got the right controls in place, and you are creating jobs, a lot of what they put in comes back into the treasury coffers via the tax system. Okay, so here's the downside. So first of all, VAT, that went up by 0.5%. And of course, it's a quick win, as I mentioned just now. There's also another increase of 0.5% on the cards for the next year, effectively bringing the VAT rate to 16%. And of course, the result of this is it's going to impact household spending. And of course, the downside of that is from an economic growth perspective as well, there's going to be an impact. So it'll have the most impact on lower income earners, even though there's been a whole lot of additional items that they're wanting to zero rate. So we'll have a look at some of those just now as well. So the negative impact on inflation, it's expected to average in 25 at 4.3 and 4.6 in 26%. So again, we have this scenario where VAT is a quick win, but it is going to impact basically everybody out there. Some taxes have gone up, so this is also another quick win because the moment you implement this, the money starts flowing. Excise duties on alcohol and tobacco products, they've all received an above inflation increase. Those are your percentages there on alcohol, tobacco, pipe. And then, of course, CBD, cannabis and hemp, there's been no mention of that, other than the fact that you can't use any of these now. Well, they're wanting to ban the use of these in the infusion with food. So potentially next year, all those gummy bears and jelly babies and those bran muffins that we were eating when we were under stress, all of that now falls away, potentially. There's a big backlash, and there is a lot of protest around that at the moment. And then the last thing here is, when you increase the price of alcohol and tobacco substantially, all you're doing is you are forcing people to go and look at alternative mechanisms, to fuel, or to rather to feed these vices. And of course, what happens is we go to the illicit trade, and just pure as a matter of interest on cigarettes cigarettes, we lose about 26 billion a year, and on alcohol about 11 billion. So what you're in effect doing is, by increasing it, you think you're going to get more money, but all you're doing is you're forcing people to go the illicit route, and that tax gets lost somewhere along the line. Okay, so also on the downside, there was no foreign employment income exemption increase. We were hoping that would be increased from the 1.25 million. We were hoping that there'd be a couple 100,000 rand added to that, which never happened. Our tax-free savings account, there's no change to that contribution limit. You can still only contribute your 36,000 per annum up to the 500,000. And for those of you that have got these type of savings accounts, just please be very careful, because if you put more money in, the banks will accept the money, but believe me, you're going to get penalized heavily in terms of the returns that you make on those if you go over these amounts. And then interest exemption, there's been no change since 2013, so it's still your first 23,000 if you're under 65. And if you're older than 65, your first 34,500 is tax-free. Medical tax credits, there was no change in the rebate amount. Sadly, when there was no change in the rebate amount, there was still a change in our contributions. So contributions, and I think one of the medical aid schemes went up about 10% this year. So yeah, so sadly, the medical tax credits are not really going to help much this year. The huge cost for government, those 30,000 individuals that are being retired off early, that cost 11 billion, as was budgeted for prior to this budget speech. That's taking effect now, and you'll see that happening over the next year or so. And then, of course, the public sector wage bill, it still hasn't really been addressed properly, and in fact, it's in fact getting worse. And believe it or not, they're actually getting an above inflation increase. So it's still the big elephant in the room, but I think everyone's nervous to go down that road to decide what needs to be done, because again, the backlash will probably be quite severe. But it can solve many, many issues if it's properly and decisively addressed. By who, we don't know. Okay, so there is a bit of an upside. So first of all, there's been no increase in the corporate tax rate, so it's still sitting at 27%. It's still very much under consideration, but again, one has to, look at this, the potential increase in this with a lot of caution, because, corporate profits being impacted by continual logistical issues. If you up their rate of tax, obviously, again, they are going to look at alternative markets. So what we've had in South Africa, sadly, is some of the profits, the corporate profits, have gone down because companies have had to slow down on production because they can't get their goods to the market with all the drama that we've been experiencing on the roads and the rail infrastructure, etc., over the last couple of years. Obviously, electricity issues. I mean, that's, we beat that to death, but we all know about the electricity impact that we've seen on companies. It does have a negative impact on the bottom line. And interesting enough, profits from mining make up about 30% of the total corporate tax that's paid. And as we all know, mining is pretty much under threat at the moment, and it potentially could have a massive impact on the fiscus if mining profits actually start to drop. So watch this space. The corporate tax rate, and with all our other current issues, or rather high corporate tax rate and all our current issues, from an investment perspective, there's a lot of institutions out there where the appetite, both foreign and local, for investment has been subdued over the last period. If you look at the amount of cash that the banks and some of the other institutions are sitting on at the moment, it's phenomenal. It's the highest it's been in many, many, many years. But again, they're not releasing that into projects, I think, until they see, things settle down and that this government of national unity is actually going to work. And I think a lot we're also waiting, for this budget speech. No increase in personal taxes. Generally, your public out there look at this and say, great, there's no increase in our personal taxes, but because we don't adjust the tax tables for inflation, bracket creep is now going to be a huge reality this year. Because remember, we've now had this 2 years in a row. So I'll show you just now what the effect of that is. It's actually quite phenomenal in terms of the percentage increase. We haven't had an implementation of wealth tax, but it's still very much spoken about. So this is not going to go away in the short term. They are going to look at some sort of mechanism to deal with this. But once again, I think there's so much legislation involved in trying to change all of this that it's going to take a lot of time. So hence you didn't see something announced almost like immediately. So let's see how that one pans out. And then there are, of course, other items under the VAT system that have now been made, VAT exempt or zero VAT. And those are things like edible offal from sheep and goats and poultry and swine and beef and those sort of things, and specific cuts. So again, the question would be, well, if you are making these items exempt, they're probably all out of the tax net anyway, okay, because of just generally the way people buy these things. So you're not actually helping citizens out there by exempting all of these. So again, there's been some adverse reaction to that. And then social grants, well, obviously that had to go up. Just as a matter of interest, we've now got, just over 19 million beneficiaries, which is it's about half of the the population that is able to work. So remember, if you've got 60 million individuals in South Africa, let's say 20 million of them cannot work because they're either under the age or they're old. So you've got 40 million odd that potentially can work, and you've got a 50% unemployment rate. So we're down to about 20. So a huge number of those are actually recipients of some beneficiary or other. Now, that's not a bad thing that government is doing something to look after these individuals, but it's a bad thing in the sense that we're not really addressing the real problem, and we're not growing the economy, and we're not creating new jobs, etc. So this is something that's potentially going to explode in the coming years. So we need to keep an eye on this. And then if you look at the types of grants, they've all gone up somewhat. But if you look at the child care grant, I mean, that couple of R100, I mean, it's just such an insignificant amount. And I mean, what people will tell you is, once they've received their grant within the next 3-4 days, it's already been used up. So it is a sad state. The social relief distress, well, those are obviously for those individuals that have been impacted by, all the rain and infrastructure that's collapsed, etc. So these are the sort of things the government has to do. A lot of it is outside of their control. So they are, as I say, increasing that. And here's a nice one. Our NHI, there was no mention of this. There has been a lot of mention, sort of adverse comments around it over many years. Is it going to go in? One quarter of our government say yes, it's going to go in. The other quarter says it's impossible to put this in. We just don't have the funds for it. So again, it wasn't really mentioned. And I think with all the other issues facing government, I think this had to be put on the back burner for now. And what's exacerbated this is obviously with the states now withdrawing those PEPFAR funds that we have always been accustomed to over the years. That's now got to be funded by ourselves. So again, this money has got to be found somewhere. On a couple of other things, state duty and donations tax unchanged, transfer duty, the rates remain it is, but the thresholds increased a bit. So if you've got a property that's under 1.2 million, obviously there's no duties on that. Capital gains tax, thankfully that didn't change either. But just a note of caution here is that cryptocurrency and crypto assets are under huge scrutiny at the moment. And SARS believes that there's a vast amount that's being lost to the fiscus through these type of assets. So they are stepping up investigations into this area. The fuel levy in the road accident fund, that remained unchanged. So that was also some good news. Things to keep an eye on over the next couple of months. Number one, SARS was given a massive boost in funding. And this will assist SARS in ramping up their collection efficiency. And there's about 800 billion, as I mentioned just now, in assessed taxes that need to be collected. So with them being able to buy new technology, implement new technology, get additional resources on board, they are going to find ways to collect this. And there are about 150,000 individuals, they say, who earn more than R1 million per annum and who are not in the tax net yet. Okay. So that's got to be addressed. So that's quite an interesting fact that as well. The tax threshold, that wasn't increased. So that means that for 2 years now, the tax threshold has not been increased. That means that many individuals who are now getting an increase this year, be it 5%, whatever, are now suddenly going to go over that tax threshold. So it means two things. They're going to be earning less. And also it means that potentially there are going to be more individuals back into the tax net again. So for those of you that are familiar with the payroll side of things, you'll know that the IT reg process is the mechanism that assists us as taxpayers and of course SARS to register individuals who have never been registered for tax. So that process is also being enhanced, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later on. So the bottom line of all this is that the tax base, there is going to be an increase, which hopefully is going to see a bit more tax coming into the tax net, because the base of that we've got at the moment in terms of the number of individuals propping up this tax system from a personal point of view is so small and very, very fragile. Okay, so here's a little drawing. I mean, most of you that have been involved in tax will know what this Laffer curve is. And I just thought I'd throw it in here just to remind you. So on the bottom there, you've got increasing tax rates. And as a result of an increasing tax rate on the left-hand side, in theory, you're going to get more tax revenue. So as the rate of tax increases, so the tax revenue will increase. But it gets to a tipping point. Okay, and that's what this Laffer curve is all about. It gets to a point where it reaches its maximum, but then it starts to decline. And the reason for that is that individuals will look at how much tax they're paying, and companies for that matter, and say, well, we're not getting much for the amount of tax that we're paying. So now we start looking at ways to avoid paying tax or even tax evasion. And remember, particularly for the wealthy, they can afford to get smart advice in terms of looking at different ways to structure their tax affairs to pay less tax. So if you push that too high, that's the effect. You're going to get individuals and companies looking at ways of actually reducing their tax liability. And in that sense, what happens is Treasury starts to lose income from the tax system. So there's been a lot of interesting stats around this recently, which we don't have time to get into today. But and if you want to have a look at these, just give us a shout. And of course, corporate taxpayers, they don't see the value or return anymore. So they also, at that point, they start to look at different ways of reducing tax. They look at tax-friendly, other tax-friendly places to operate their businesses in. They push the tax law to its limits. In other words, they sail a lot closer to the wind. And of course, they get very savvy in terms of setting up complex tax structures, again, to move profits and assets, etc., between entities. So these are the kind of things that people do if you push them hard enough. So I just want to show you this. So this is just a summary of last year's statistics. And these are your different tax types. And the one on the left is the personal income tax. And if you look at the bottom, you'll see the amount of tax that's brought in to the tax net through the personal income tax system. So it makes up 37% of revenue. So it is an area that SARS continually has to look at. They've got to get, they try and get as efficient as they can to collect this money, but also it's one of those areas that's very sensitive. So if you start fiddling too much with this, you actually start losing income. So about 1.5% of South Africans pay 61% of all income tax. I mean, that's a huge number. So that's about 980,000 people, of which only just over 200,000 of those pay 33% of this. So there's a small number of individuals that really prop up the entire tax system from a personal income perspective. Then the other thing is that it was mentioned that there was a 12% increase in personal income tax that came into Treasury, or came into SARS rather. So the question is that a great thing or is it not? But if you look at why this actually increased, number one, SARS, again, we get back to this massive windfall that SARS had in terms of the two-pot system and how much money they made out of that. And of course, fiscal drag, because we didn't change the tax tables, those that got a 5% increase last year obviously ended up paying more tax as well. If we just have a quick comparison over the last couple of years, you can see that personal income tax has dropped actually, despite some of the initiatives from last year, i.e. fiscal drag and the two-pot system. VAT is pretty much the same. Corporate tax has gone up a little bit. That was thank you to the mining environment. And by the way, we're looking at figures here over the last sort of 5 years or so. And then other taxes remained pretty much the same as well. So we seem to be bringing in the same amount of tax. And in fact, what should have happened, okay, is that when you're in an economy that is thriving and growing, all of these taxes should be going up over a 5-year period. And as you can see, we've pretty much stagnated. And here's an interesting one. I don't want to cause any controversy out there, but have a look at the difference between the male and the female in terms of income coming in. Up until about the 500,000 per annum mark, you'll see we are pretty much equal, but look what happens above the 500, okay, is it gets very, very skewed again from towards the male. Okay, in terms of earnings capacity. So I thought that was actually quite interesting, and now you'll understand why. And this is not just South Africa, but worldwide. There's a lot of statistics now being shown about the income comparisons between male and female, particularly up at executive level. So I thought that was quite interesting that I would share with you as well. So individuals that are registering for tax grew by 1 million. Companies that registered actually came down by 7%. People that are working, the 75 plus individuals, they are continuing to work. They increased over 10 years by 100,000 people, and their contribution to the fiscus is tenfold. So there's an enormous amount of money from a tax perspective still coming from those so-called individuals that have retired but are now still working. Okay. Individuals are earning above the 1.5 million. There's about 133,000 of those in South Africa. So it's not a lot. And they, as I say, they are the third highest contributor to total taxes. And then individuals below the tax threshold, i.e. not paying tax, there's just over 7 million of them. So again, by not increasing the tax tables, or the tax threshold rather, a lot of those individuals, when they get increases this year, or let's say this tax year, a lot of those individuals are now going to find their way into the tax net. And you'll see, if we look at these figures next year, we should see some interesting changes. And then for those of you that want to know where all the money is, well, Gauteng is where the highest salaries are being paid, and Gauteng is where the most contribution to the fiscus actually happens. Sadly, although we pay the highest amount of taxes, it's where the most tax is collected, but it's probably in its worst state of repair, sadly. So I thought I'd just throw that in. This one over here is also quite interesting. The blue section is the makeup of money that comes in through personal tax returns. As you can see, 75% of that is made up of salaries and wages and remuneration. The next is the red section, which are all annual payments. These are bonuses and restraint of trade payments, all those kind of things fall in under there. Unfortunately, I didn't fall into that red block, so I'm quite sad about that. Pension income, you can see, is quite high, etc. So I'm not going to go through all those in detail, but it's just interesting to see what the makeup is of money that comes into SARS. But this is what is interesting, is the largest allowance still paid, okay, is the travel allowance. And when you look at when SARS do their audits, you'll find that the first thing they look at is travel, subsistence, those kind of things, because that's, as I say, the largest allowances that are paid. And the second are, which is a good thing, and these are contributions to retirement funds. So this is the largest deduction from tax and the largest fringe benefit. So obviously there's still a lot of emphasis on individuals and companies putting money into retirement, which is a good thing. So for those of you that are going through audits, just bear in mind that these will be probably the 3 items that SARS will look at first. Okay, this one over here, for those of you that are using the ETI system, we go back to 2013 or 2014 when it was first introduced. As you can see, the number of companies utilizing that has kind of increased. Then during the COVID years, it started to decrease. Straight after the COVID year, it then increased because obviously individuals were, or companies were wanting to scratch for whatever money they could get. There were some new incentives that were put in place. So obviously in the 2021 year, that did increase. 2021-22, that decreased because again, we had a scenario where many companies were closing down, and as a result, they weren't claiming ETI anymore. And so it has been steadily reducing. And the question is why? Well, very simply, if you look at that, that's 10 years. So the individuals that qualified for that have now probably gone out of the system because they're now older than the age of 29. But there's very, very few youngsters coming in that that employers are entitled to claim ETI for. So that is pretty much on its way down. And I think also because SARS have become quite strict in terms of how they're auditing all of this as well. So that's an interesting figure as well. So you be the judge. Was this a good budget speech? Not a good budget speech? We still have a long way to go. And we're nowhere out of the woods yet because all of you know that there is still massive debate going on at the moment in the government of national unity. There are still certain parties that are digging their heels in about the VAT. And what is interesting is, normally when there's a budget speech, everyone has agreed to the numbers before the budget speech actually takes place. Because when you've got one party, i.e. the ANC, it's all agreed beforehand, and it's just literally signing the paperwork after the budget speech. This year, we have a very different scenario. Okay, this budget speech is still very much proposals, which means that it could still change. So, over the coming weeks, we really don't know how this is going to pan out, but there's still lots of debate, lots of fighting going on about this. Okay, so let's have a look at some of these implications. Okay, so in terms of our tax tables, that's always our first point of departure. We always look at it and we say, okay, well, how does it impact us from an individual perspective? And two things. Number one, we're still sitting with the 18% and the 45%, which is the highest rate. So nothing has changed there, thankfully. But again, bracket creep is going to creep in terribly for those that have received increases over the last 2 years or so. So this is just an example. Again, I'm not going to go through any great detail, but what it's doing is it's showing you the fact that the tax table hasn't changed, what the impact is from an individual perspective. So if you just take the guy in the middle there, the 680,000, okay, his tax last year, this year, he's going to pay the same amount of tax. His average rate of tax is the same. Obviously, there's no difference. So this is simple. So this is looking at these figures against the table as it is right now. Okay. If the table stays as is, but the individual gets a 5% salary increase. Okay, let's go back to the guy in the middle there, the 680. You can see naturally he's going to pay more tax because he's got a 5% increase, but his average rate of tax has also now increased. So there's a difference of about just over 1%. So what this is telling us is that because the table hasn't changed, when the individual gets an increase, and particularly those that go into the new tax bracket, they're going to pay more tax. So a 5% increase in salary, you're not going to see a 5% increase in tax. You're going to see more than that. Then this picture over here shows us an individual, that same individual, but this is where he gets a 5% increase. And if the actual tables had changed, if we did get a new set of tax tables that were adjusted for inflation, this is what it would have looked like. So again, you can see we're going back into the green again. So the individual would have paid a little bit more tax. His average rate would have gone up just a little slightly, which it would have, we would have expected it to do. But because this hasn't happened, the net effect, again, going to this guy in the middle, just in the last year, he's got a 5% increase, but his tax is going up by 7.5%. So it just shows you that when you don't adjust the tax tables for inflation, it's all fair and well to give individuals increases, but because there's been no adjustment in the tax table, people's average rate of tax actually does increase, and it pushes them into the next tax bracket a lot quicker than normal, and they end up paying a lot more tax. And here's just an example that we work with Mazars, and one of the ladies, Di Seacom, she often does some talks for us, and she got her guys to do a very detailed spreadsheet to work this out. But have a look at this. They took an individual who earns 40,000 a month, and they said, let's assume they gets this 5% increase. So in the 2023 tax year, right, his tax paid was 113,000 on the 40,000 per month. So in the following years, in 2024, a 5% increase was fine. Okay, he would pay a little bit more tax. In 2025, he paid 13% more tax, and in 2026, 26% more tax, okay, instead of the 15%. So you can see here that the net effect of this is really, really tough. And again, it gets back to what I said earlier on. You don't realize this or employees won't realize this from day one. It slowly starts to catch up. So when the VAT increase takes effect, and when all of these other things that, as a result of the budget speech start to take effect, and the individual gets an increase, and his first thought is, thank goodness I've got an increase. But if you look at it over a 4, 5, 6 month period, this is the net effect. And this is when you find that in August, September of this year, employees start to come to the payroll department and say, I don't understand this, but I'm not coming out. I've got this increase. What's actually going on? So again, the individual doesn't realize this from day one. It's over a period of time. And often what happens is when we wake up to the fact that we can't come out and costs have not caught up with us, it's actually too late. And particularly for the guys at the bottom end of the earnings scale, what is the first thing that they do? They need to get through the next month. So they go and borrow money somewhere where they shouldn't. And that's the sad net effect of these sort of things. People at the top end of the earnings scale, I'm not saying that it's good for them, but they can absorb this somehow. They just spend a little bit less, and they don't go out for those dinners every Friday night. They go out every second Friday night. So they save a bit of money. But as I say, the sad thing is this hits the bottom end of the earnings scale much more than it hits the top end of the earnings scale. Okay, so in terms of the other items, if we look at things like the rebates and the thresholds, all of those are exactly the same. And just remember, in terms of the tax threshold, what I said earlier on, the moment the guy gets an increase and he goes above the 95,000, he could be very close to that. He's not paying tax at the moment, but the moment he goes over that, he starts paying tax. So he's actually going to start losing out. If we look at subsistence allowance, that's increased a little bit. So that was almost inflationary, about 4.5%. So there you can see this year for incidental costs inside South Africa, it's 176 per day. And for meals and incidental costs, it's 570 odd. I just want to remind you about a couple of things here. A lot of companies will pay an employee what they call advanced subsistence allowance. So they know that he's going to travel for the next 4 or 5 months. So they give him an upfront payment. And after the 4 or 5 months is over, they reconcile everything. Now, that's fine when you are doing your tax returns or you're submitting all this data to SARS every 6 months or once a year, because that's really when SARS gets to see a picture of what's happened to that employee. They're only seeing the end result on the RP5. They don't see what actually happens on a month-to-month basis. But when SARS does an audit, they will look for these sort of things. They want to know why you're paying advances, and if so, the employee's got the benefit of that money before he's incurred the cost. Why aren't you? Why isn't he paying fringe benefit tax? So there's all sorts of nuances around that. So again, please just be careful about paying your employees advances when it comes to subsistence allowance. The other thing is that SARS have also picked up, and they're coming down quite heavily on this. What happens is we send the employee away on the Thursday and Friday for business, and he says, well, can I stay for the weekend? And we pay the subsistence allowance for the Saturday and the Sunday as well. SARS wants evidence that the person actually worked on the Saturday and the Sunday doing something, okay, that is business related in order for that to apply. And if not, then obviously SARS rejects that. So again, a lot of awkward questions that get asked by SARS in these sort of instances. So watch out for that one. And then again, for an individual that goes away for a day, so he doesn't spend the night away, because a lot of individuals are saying, I don't want to spend a night away from home. Just where we are in this country, I'd rather be home. So what they do is they catch an early flight out and they get back at 7, 8 o'clock at night. Now, in that case, in theory, okay, a subsistence allowance doesn't get paid, but a reimbursement amount can actually be paid. So there's often confusion between the difference, between a reimbursement amount and a subsistence amount, because the two amounts of the 176 are the same. So just watch out for this one as well. But it is quite legitimate to pay an individual this 176 per day as a reimbursement amount, as long as it gives you, all the substantiating slips and those kind of things. So that's the little thing that you need to bear in mind about the subsistence allowances. Okay, and then we move on to travel. So here's your new travel table. What has actually happened, which is quite interesting, is that the prescribed rate per kilometer, that's been reduced from 4.84 down to 4.76. I fail to understand why it would have come down. They say it's because the petrol price on average over the last year has come down and maintenance costs have come down, and there's all sorts of reasons. But I don't know. To me, it just doesn't make sense. But be that as it may, that's your new rate per kilometer. And again, I just want to reiterate that that rate per kilometer, the 4.76, you can pay the employee as many kilometers as you want. So he can travel as much as, there's no limit to this. So however many kilometers he travels, if you pay him that rate, there's no tax implications. As soon as you go over that rate, whatever the amount over the rate is, that becomes a taxable benefit. Okay, so that goes in as a fringe benefit, and obviously there's tax implications. So again, just watch out for that one. The travel table, obviously, as I say, those numbers have changed as well. So what we've done here, I'm not going to go through this in any great detail because we just don't have time for it, but we've put in a few examples of when you use the prescribed rate versus when you use the travel table itself, and what are the RP5 codes that you use. So if you read through this in your own time, it'll just confirm what you probably already know, or if you just want some additional input on how these things actually work, you'll find it in here. So there's a few examples. So I'm just going to scroll through them because, as I said, we don't have time to go through all of this. There's a summary of which RP5 code to use when you have a combination of a travel allowance and you're paying a reimbursement to the individual. So watch out for these things, because these, as I mentioned earlier on, these are big ticket items for SARS when they do an audit. Okay. And then just the last thing before we have a 10-minute break, because we're now just about at 10 o'clock, just a couple of reminders. So if you use your bicycle to work, you can't claim mileage on that. But interestingly enough, in a couple of parts or a couple of countries in Europe, and Holland for one, there is some sort of tax break if you use a bicycle. So they're obviously trying to encourage the use of bicycles for, as you all know, a number of reasons. But in South Africa, you can't put in a claim, okay, for using your mountain bike to go and visit a customer. Also, e-bikes, although they are motorized, you obviously, again, can't claim anything for this. Motorbikes, if you use the motorbike, they fall into the same category as a motor vehicle, i.e. it's motorized. So obviously, you know, the claims are still valid. Electric cars, this is going to be a difficult one, and there's not much thought in this yet. Okay, because in theory, electric car can't fall under the travel table because there's no fuel costs involved, and the maintenance of it is very different. So I don't know, maybe one day they put an electricity meter in your car and you'll purchase electricity from Pick and Pay or Checkers, and then you'll go back to your employer with a little slip. But again, this is something that has not taken off in South Africa yet, but it's starting to take off very much so in Europe, particularly in Europe, where they're wanting to get rid of all petrol, diesel-based cars over the next sort of 7 to 10 years. So there's no ruling on this yet, but I'm sure it's going to happen within the next couple of years. So keep an eye out for that one. And then lift clubs, there's no tax break on this one. Use of things like Uber, Bolt, train, bus, car train, etc. It's basically the same as a flight cost. So if your employer sends you somewhere and you use any one of these means of transport, it's a direct cost. So obviously, there's no tax implication. You claim it back from the employer on an invoice or a slip. Okay, so watch for that one. And then employer-provided transport. So this is where the employer has a bus and they go to a central point and they collect all the employees from somewhere, bring them all to work, and then after work, they take them all back and drop them off at the same place. Under that circumstance, it's deemed as a zero value benefit. Have a look at interpretation note 111. It actually gives you a lot more detail about this. But the bottom line here is that there's no fringe benefit value or no tax implication to the individuals that make use of that service, unless that driver, what he does is he drops people off at different shopping centers and waits for them to do their shopping, or he takes them to the creche to go and fetch their kids. In that instance, there is private use of that benefit. Now, I don't know how SARS would prove that, but again, under those conditions, there is some sort of tax implication. So again, just watch out for these sort of things. And then the use of a pool car. So this is becoming quite prominent, where the pool car then gets converted to a company car and gets given to an employee. Okay, in that case, you've got to revalue the car, and you've got to put a value, as you would a new car, against that for the employee for fringe benefit purposes for that specific employee. But if the pool car is incidental, it's used incidentally by an individual, there's an emergency and he uses the car, there's no tax implication there. And as long as this pool car is available to be used by all employees during office hours and it stays at the office overnight or over weekends, then there's no tax implication. However, if there is some sort of exclusive use by an employee and it's used after hours and weekends, you've got to work out what that benefit is. So that does become a taxable benefit. So as I say, please just watch out for these things, because again, SARS loves to look at this area in terms of travel, how you're claiming, how you're paying employees, how pool cars have been used, etc. And interesting enough, I mean, we've even come across lots of instances where when SARS does the audit, they go to the receptionist and say, that car out there in the parking lot, who uses that, which employees use it, and is it parked here overnight? That's the way SARS actually found out how these pool cars are actually potentially being abused. So please be careful of these sort of things. SARS will eventually catch up with you. Okay, and then what we'll now do is, before we get into the medical side of things, it's 10 o'clock. So if you guys are comfortable, let's have a 10-minute, grab a cup of coffee, grab a glass of water, have a quick leg stretch, and then we'll come back in 10 minutes and carry on. Okay. All right, everybody. We've had our 10 minutes. I'm sure you're all back and all raring to go again. So where we left off was we're about to start talking about medical aid and the tax credits there. So the medical tax credit for the year didn't change, so that's still sitting at 364 for the main member and 364 for the first dependent, and then any other dependents thereafter is at 246. Just one thing I do want to remind you of is that an employee can belong to a scheme that's an international scheme, which often does happen, but just bear in mind that if he wants the benefit of the medical tax credit on a month-to-month basis, i.e. via the payroll, you as the employer, you've got to get proof that he belongs to the scheme, and you've got to get regular proof that he's actually paying this in order for this to be available to him. So that was just one thing I wanted to remind you of. In terms of, sorry, let me just get this thing working again. That's interesting. There we go. Okay, so in terms of retired employees, just remember that contributions made or any expenses that you've covered on behalf of a deceased or a legally retired employee are not taxable. Obviously, if the employee meets the definition of a legally retired employee, you can continue to pay this if the employee has retired. Remember, when an employee retires, you have a retirement contract with the individual, but then if you bring him back on contract again, there are a little bit of there's a couple of different tax rules around that. But the fact that he's working back with you on contract does not negate the fact that as the employer, part of his retirement package was that you continue paying the medical benefits, of which there are no tax implications. Okay, so watch out for that one. And then also just remember, we're on the IRP5. You record this, that's in code 4493, and obviously a IT3 must be submitted as well. This one, please be careful about this one. These are contributions split or shared between two individuals. So what you do have is, let's say, two siblings are sponsoring the medical costs of their, let's say, retired parents. What often happens is both individuals, they, as I say, they share the expense, but what they do is they claim the full medical tax credit. Now, you'll notice on the tax return, there is a question about that now. So SARS has picked it up that they are paying the medical tax credit out twice in theory, but the employee is only paying half of the contribution. So please just watch out for that. So again, when an employee joins you, you're well within your rights as an employer to ask the question about who's paying the actual contribution, because remember with SARS, if the employer gets this wrong, the employee gets the benefit, but the SARS does come after the employer if this is done incorrectly, let alone the employee. So watch out for this one. There's a lot of cases of this going around at the moment. Okay, residential accommodation, I'm not going to go through that. Just to make a note there, that to do the calculation, remember there's the tax threshold that comes into this calculation, and it hasn't changed. It normally changes every year, and it's based upon the actual tax threshold. But this year it hasn't changed, so the 95,750 still applies in terms of the residential accommodation calculation. Okay, and of course, if there's any other direct cost to the employer, that becomes a fringe benefit value, etc. This is also a whole area on its own, which could take us a good few hours to discuss, particularly where it comes down to the use of holiday accommodation that is owned by the employer, and how to calculate that value. But that's a discussion for another day. All right, just a couple of reminders. Number one, employees on different remuneration levels could incur a higher fringe benefit value for the same residential unit. It is what it is. You could have two employees earning completely different salaries, but living or using exactly the same accommodation, and the one employee pays more than the other because of his higher earnings and because of the fact that the fringe benefit value works out higher. There's many issues within employers around that, and often SARS gets asked to get involved as well. Where you have a spouse or spouses working together for the same employer, and they're both entitled to the benefit, the higher earner is generally used in the formula. So you can't say, well, the person who earns the least will use that as the basis for the calculation. You've got to use the person that earns the most. And bear in mind, these things do come out of the woodwork at assessment time. You'll get away with it during the year, but somewhere, somehow, SARS does cotton onto this, and often it happens in an audit as well. Okay, so I'm not going to go through any great detail here. We can always do something separate around accommodation. Scholarships and bursaries, again, just a quick reminder, there's no limited value to the employee as long as it's for the benefit of the employer. So an example would be you can't really get away with putting a guy on if you're in a manufacturing company and you're making nuts and bolts and you put a guy on a bursary scheme to make him a doctor, as an example. I mean, that's a ridiculous example, but in that case, SARS will have an issue with that. Bear in mind that in the old days, we had the option of a salary sacrifice, again, to save some tax, but this practice was discontinued in 2021. It was encouraged in earlier years because Treasury wanted employers to assist employees from an education point of view. So they encouraged salary sacrifice, but that, as I say, fell away in 2021 because SARS is now looking at this and they're saying, well, you know, we used to get this money and we used to get the tax, but now you're taking it away. So you're actually taking tax away from us. So SARS have an issue with that. And again, this pops out in an audit. And remember, obviously, things like on-the-job training, that is really not taxable because it's important to upskill the individual to make him better at his job. So whatever training you send the employee on in relation to that, there's no tax implications. All right, and if you go to Interpretation Notice 66, there are some interesting bits of information and examples on how these bursaries actually work. This one is just to do with the relative of an employee. So remember, there's two things you can do here in terms of bursaries. One is the bursary to the employee. One is the other is the bursary to a relative. So this is to kids or to brothers and sisters or blood relatives. But it's also recently been extended to those individuals for whom the employee is liable to providing care and support to. So if I've adopted someone or I've just taken someone on board and that's my responsibility to look after this person and make sure that they're cared for, those individuals, I mean, obviously there's got to be proof, but those individuals also fall in under the category of a relative. If you are going to provide a bursary to a relative, or apply for a bursary for a relative that is disabled, there's got to be that proof. So there's that ITR DD form that has to accompany that. Otherwise, the employer can't provide that bursary and get the tax benefit. And just remember that the employer is no longer going to have a tax exemption. It's not going to apply if there's been an element of a salary sacrifice. So read through some of these things. There's some interesting information in here. Again, I'm not going to go through all that, but if you write off, for instance, if the employee moves from one company to another and you write off the amount that he owes, there is no fringe benefit implication if his new employer takes over that bursary and continues to pay. Okay, and the employee continues to be on the bursary scheme. So there's, where there's two employers involved, you can also prevent the employee from having to pay taxes. This gets a bit sensitive because now two employers have to talk to each other, which is not always a good idea, particularly if the employee is left and the relationship has not been that great with his previous employer. Okay, so watch out for that one. Obviously, all bursaries have got to be disclosed on the RP5. And again, just imagine your 18 million RP5s coming into SARS, and all of this information sits on an RP5 SARS. They have analytics tools that look at this information. It gives them a good idea as to how many employers out there are providing bursaries to individuals or any sort of assistance, and they can help. It helps them with their planning for the following year. So this is obviously important to do this. Okay, and just remember that any award, whether you give them a gold watch or you give them cash or whatever, for completing or passing this bursary, it's deemed as a taxable benefit. So unfortunately, it is what it is. This is just an example of what the amounts are, the tax-free amounts available for bursaries. This hasn't changed for a number of years. We were actually expecting this to be changed in this budget speech, but for obvious reasons it wasn't. So these are still the figures that you must work with. This is just an example of where on the RP5 these amounts get stored. So your payroll system should generally have all of this set up for you. But this is it's good just to know what information goes where on the RP5. It is important because, once again, if ever you're faced with a SARS audit, these are the kind of things that SARS will actually look for. Okay, this one here in terms of foreign earnings exemption. So remember, before March, South African residents could exempt their foreign earnings if they met the days requirement. You remember that, the 183 days and the 60 days consecutive. But this was removed, making all foreign income taxable up to, in many cases, 45%. Thereafter, they introduced that threshold. It started off with the million, and it later was increased to the 1.250, meaning that earnings above this amount were taxed in South Africa. And then they introduced the 6 quad provision, which allowed for a tax credit to be provided if those taxes or those earnings had been taxed by a foreign entity, and that way they were preventing double taxation. So that, as I say, came in a while ago. And obviously this section 1010 only applies to employees under a formal contract, okay, regardless of employer residency, okay, but it obviously excludes independent contractors and government employees, those sort of things. Okay, so just bear this one in mind. Again, we were hoping that 1.25 would be increased, which it wasn't, sadly. This is just a note about tax residency and the ordinary resident, the physical presence test. This is all in the documentation somewhere. Again, this is something that takes a couple of hours to go through. Just bear in mind that whilst you're a tax resident, a South African tax resident, no matter where you work in the world, you will be taxed on the foreign income. As soon as you are no longer a tax resident, then obviously that changes. But if you're a South African and you're still a tax resident and you're working around the world, there are tax implications of what your earnings are. But bear in mind, you can credit the tax paid in a foreign country. It gets a bit complicated. So, for those individuals that fall under this category, it's always good to get professional advice on how to get your tax affairs structured correctly. Otherwise, you could end up either paying too much tax, and of course, this receiver is not going to tell you that you're paying too much tax, or you could be under tax, in which case you'll potentially be penalized. So this is something that you do need to be careful about. And then just remember that as from March 2021, or a reminder rather, only individuals who've been non-tax residents for at least 3 consecutive years can withdraw their retirement funds. Remember, in the old days, if you ceased to be a tax resident, you went to another country and you immigrated, you had access almost immediately to all your retirement funds. That changed in 2021, and now you have to wait 3 years, and you've got to meet certain requirements before you can actually get that money. And that, by the way, it caused a lot of aggravation and issues for people that were immigrating who wanted to use their pension as a means to start up, their life in a new country. And of course, that put a dampener on things. So this has not been a good change. And as I say, a lot of individuals, have obviously complained about this. So please just watch out for that one. Okay, and then this is tax on retirement funds. These are for returning individuals. So remember, under current tax rules, lump sum payments from retirement funds, those are funds received by South African tax residents, are exempt from tax if they relate to work done whilst outside of South Africa. So you'd have typically an individual going to work in, let's say, the UK for 3 years. There's a whole contribution that gets made to his retirement fund there. He now comes back to South Africa and he wants to bring that money back to South Africa. So there is another change that's going to be enforced soon, and that is to do with that money coming back into South Africa. There is going to be a tax implication, whereas in the past there wasn't. So that's become a bit of an issue as well. So obviously the potential deterrent is to those who are considering returning to South Africa and bringing this money back and investing it in South Africa. So please watch out for that one. Okay, let's have a look at some other items around what's happening with SARS. So this is just the tax law amendments bill. This apportionment of retirement fund contributions cap. You know that you're only allowed to contribute as a deduction against remuneration of 350,000. So what you were finding was that in month 1 and 2, an individual would contribute as much as he could to make up the 350,000, and thereafter his contributions for the remainder of the year obviously wouldn't have the tax break. But there was all sorts of issues when that individual left that employer and joined the new employer. There was no way that the new employer knew how much he'd actually paid or contributed, so they would allow him the same deduction. And then this all came out in the wash at the end of the tax year. So what's happening now is SARS are now saying, no, you've got to apportion this properly during the course of the month. But also what's important here is that with a lot of individuals that were ceasing to be a tax resident, what would happen is you'd close off a tax period. So let's assume that the individual is now no longer a tax resident as at, let's say, June. So there would be let's call it 2 tax years in 1 tax year. And in theory, you could get the benefit of the 350,000 in the first 6 months and again in the second 6 months. Likewise with the contributions to a tax-free savings account. And this loophole has now actually been plugged as well. So you can't do that anymore. Individuals with 2 tax reference numbers. I don't know if any of you have experienced this, but we often have scenarios where an employee now sits with 2 tax reference numbers, but he doesn't know this. Okay, and this often happens where an employee is let's say he's a foreigner, and then he becomes a South African citizen. And then what happens is, whilst he's working as a foreigner, they use his passport details to allocate him a tax number. And then as soon as he becomes South African, he gets a South African ID, and then he gets a new tax reference number. Now, the employee and the employer just assume that in the background, all of these issues have been taken care of, only to find out that all of a sudden this individual gets hit with a penalty, an admin penalty of some sort, because he didn't submit a tax return under his old number. So that's created a whole lot of issues. So this is something new that they're putting in. I'll give you a little bit of detail about this just now as well. The anomaly relating to employer-paid contributions to a retirement fund, and this is an individual who is outside of the country and he falls under that section 1010 ruling. Employer-paid contributions were not deemed as remuneration, okay, and it's now been included in the employee's income for the purposes of this. What also happened is, for those of you that managed to get your 15,000 Rand rebate for your solar panels, that's now been discontinued, sadly. It was a great incentive, that. And then the other thing that has also come in from the tax or the administration laws amendment bill, and that's to do with the whole alternate dispute resolution, the ADR mechanism. So SARS has been looking at shortening this process by bringing forward particularly the appeal stage. So it's still being evaluated at the moment, but this is something that they very definitely want to look at, because again, when we have an issue with SARS, SARS is trying to shorten that entire process to get some sort of resolution and then move on. These things are taking far too long and costing too much at the moment. Okay, for those of you that are on the employment tax incentive scheme, so this new change deals with training providers who manage employees and claim on the employer's behalf. So what happens is you create this concept of fictitious employment to exploit the incentive. So the employee or the person that's on the scheme doesn't really know who he actually works for, but the third party company, the training vendor, actually claim on behalf of the employer, but they get this employee to do work that's got absolutely nothing to do with the employer that he's supposed to be working for. So they're putting in a whole lot of punitive measures, and they're really looking at all the fines around this as well. We've actually already seen this. We've had an example of this about a month ago. We got a 10-page letter that someone received from SARS, an official sort of legal notice around this, and exactly that happened to them. It was a small group of employees that they'd outsourced to someone. They were claiming the ETI, and the company that was doing this was training these individuals by making them hand out pamphlets at the robot. So that obviously, one can see is not the right thing. And obviously SARS picked up on this. So again, the question is always, who does the individual actually work for? Okay, is he employed? Is he being trained to do work for the company that he's employed for? And is there a potential of that individual being ultimately employed by that company? So again, if you're using the ETI scheme, please just check it, make sure that it's legitimate, because SARS is coming down on this very hard at the moment. Okay, the cross-referencing of this is just a technical thing. It's to do with remuneration proxy. So, remuneration proxy is used when you want to give an individual a benefit that is based upon the coming year's earnings. Okay, this is really just to do with how do you actually calculate that and what is an associated institution. So it's really more of a technical thing, Andy, but again, just have a look at that. This one is a big one. These are refunds under Section 11 NA. So an example of this is an individual gets enticed to join a company. So he gets a sign-on bonus, or there's a bursary that's got to be paid back, or a person gets given a whole lot of sick and maternity benefits that at some point have to be paid back. So these are all to do with money that's paid to the employee that at some point the employee, for whatever reason, has to pay it back. Now, if we take a retention bonus as an example, so what happens is the employee gets paid R1 million to join the business. He gets taxed on it straight away. So let's assume he's on 45%. So he takes home the 550,000, and 450 of that then goes to the receiver in taxes. Now, 3 months later, the relationship goes pear-shaped, and the employee now has to pay the employer back that amount of money. Now, legally, he's got to pay the full $1 million back, although he didn't have the 450 because that's now sitting with SARS. So he claims that back at the end of the tax year when he does his assessment, but he's now out of pocket. So what SARS are wanting to do is just change the way this works and to try and give the employee some of that tax back over the remainder of the tax year. So it's not perfect, but it is some way of assisting the individual. So they're introducing or changing the whole way that this refund actually works. And there's some new fields on the RP5 that they're considering as well. So I'll get into a little bit more detail just now. Transferring of funds between retirement funds. Okay, so here again, members who reach a retirement age before retirement date, okay, can now transfer funds without incurring a tax liability. So all this happened kind of in line with when we had the two-pot system coming in last year. So that's quite a good a change as well. And then clarifying the VAT treatment of the supply of services to non-resident subsidiaries of companies that are based in South Africa. Okay, just check this. This is generally not a payroll-related problem, but it could be a problem for intercompany charging for recovery of employee costs, where you've got the international company being billed by the local company for the cost of staff and vice versa. So depending on how you've set that relationship up, there might be a VAT implication. So I'll put this in here just to remind you that if you do have that scenario, just go and check. All right, tax directives, that really did take a pounding this last year since the introduction of the two-pot system. We had massive volumes. Okay, SARS, I think SARS issued about just over 2 million tax directives. So as you can imagine, they were all requested pretty much around the same time. So again, not only do you have massive volumes, but you have massive volumes in a very short space of time. So there was a lot of issues around that. There was a lot of funds that were complaining. There was a lot of confusion between taxpayers and the administrators. There was a lot of misunderstandings around tax rates because SARS said one thing and the employee said, no, that's not true. I'm on a different tax rate. So there was all sorts of issues around that. And again, just in terms of one of the issues was the submission or the request for tax directive. There was so many issues that they had with incomplete information being provided. So they didn't always specify what the other taxable earnings were. So the tax rates were not being applied properly. But that, again, will come out in the wash now when we do the submissions. Believe it or not, in some instances, there were individuals claiming or asking for a tax directive and they didn't even have a tax reference number. So obviously SARS threw that out. And in the meantime, in the back end, directives for all other types of earnings, retrenchment payments, lump sum payments from provident funds and pension funds, all of those directives still had to continue. So as I say, SARS seriously did have their hands full around tax directives last year. So that's been resolved. So what I've done here is I've just included the different tax directive types, what is applicable, which code they appear on the RP5, and which forms you are supposed to complete. This is, again, a 2-hour discussion, but I put this in so you guys can just read through it and, just check what you're doing just to make sure that you're in line. Okay, and then for those of you that have got all sorts of things stashed away that, SARS is going to catch up with you at some stage. Obviously, there's the VDP program, which used to be referred to as the amnesty program. So that has been the procedural stuff behind that has been changed a little bit. And again, the benefits of this is if you go and apply for one of these VDP programs, if you apply for it, there's no criminal prosecution. But the important thing is that you've got to get in first. Okay, so you can't go to SARS after they found that you've been non-compliant and say, sorry, but I'm now going to come clean. You've got to come clean first. Okay, and then SARS will investigate. So, as I say, the interesting thing here, number one, there's no criminal prosecution if you go through this process properly. Obviously, confidentiality is guaranteed because it is SARS that you're dealing with. And you can potentially get penalties and interest and that sort of thing reduced, depending on the nature. But interesting enough, they were very active this past year. There were nearly 1,500 applications. And a lot of them were due to the employer not paying SARS, their PAYE, SDL, they had cash flow issues, so they just didn't pay. In those instances, they went to SARS and said, okay, we've been naughty. Before you catch us, this is what we've done. How do we solve the problem? So, as I said, there was a lot of those instances. And of course, for high net worth individuals who were not disclosing assets or undervaluing their assets. So that was also an issue. And as I say, this VDP program was quite successful in addressing that. So SARS, through this process, netted about 3.3 billion just from that program in the past year. The introduction and resulting success of the SARS AI initiatives, please do not underestimate this. We are seeing firsthand, because we're quite involved with what SARS are doing. Don't underestimate this, okay? SARS are getting unbelievably smart with these AI tools now. And as I say, you need to get in first, otherwise SARS will reject your application if they've already started looking or investigating you. All right, and then obviously the enforcements that are currently underway, the methods that they use is, there's two of them. There's the soft enforcement where they say, I'll send you a letter, they'll send you some communication, and it all sounds very pleasant. And then eventually, they get tired of you ignoring them. And then the hard enforcement actually starts, and they do full-on audits, and obviously legal action then takes place. So again, this is a very useful program. And again, if you are planning to use this, make sure you get in before SARS starts to investigate you. Otherwise, they will reject your application. Okay, you've got to make full disclosure. And by the way, PAYE is always the easy pickings because that's where they pick up the most issues. And although they are small issues, the multiples of those small issues add up. And that's why, as I say, SARS likes to do their audits on PAYE. This is one that also you need to be careful about, okay, because there is potential liability, personal liability. That's to the shareholder. They can come at the shareholder, the financial officer, or the director. So again, don't take this lightly. And then crypto assets is another area. So the majority of recent applications are around crypto assets, which is quite interesting. And the AI tools that SARS are starting to use, they're starting to connect the dots by using these tools. And some traders and some service providers are already submitting electronically to SARS. They are legally obliged to do this. I know that one of the big popular providers in South Africa already funnel information through to SARS, and the SARS AI tool picks this up and connects it to you, and then it starts adding all these things to your assets, etc. So I read an article the other day which SARS published, which I don't necessarily believe. I think they got the stats wrong, but they're talking about the possibility of 5.8 million crypto assets are being held by South Africans. Now, that doesn't mean that there's 5.8 million people that have got crypto assets. I don't believe that. But it certainly means that you could have one individual that has maybe got 10 or 20 different types of crypto assets. And that's why they are seeing them, because they're not all connected, they are seeing them as different individuals. But believe me, What SARS is doing at the moment around crypto assets is pretty phenomenal work. And they are picking these things up, and they are able to check what you have and profits and losses. And it's very much like the banks. SARS can now see what you've invested, what your profit has been, and to that, also to a degree, what losses you've made. And obviously there's a way that you can incorporate that if you ring fence these things. So again, this is something that SARS is looking at. They are starting to monitor all the known traders in South Africa, and they are starting to look at what your declarations have been in terms of capital gains, losses or profits. So for those of you, or for your employees that are into crypto assets, please be careful of this one. This is coming like a tidal wave at the moment, because so many individuals are investing in this. But as I say, SARS is saying that there's a big leakage from a tax perspective, so they are using AI to specifically look into these. Okay, so as I say, SARS is rapidly getting a lot smarter around these things. So again, before you go and jump into the deep end and do anything, please get some professional advice around this. Speak to your auditors, speak to your accountants. There are specialists in the industry that deal with these sort of things. So do get advice on it. All right, and then, okay, we know about this, the rate of interest. There are some reminders that there's a reminder that this has actually changed. So we're now sitting at 8.5%. Remember, there are tax implications where you provide a loan to an employee and you don't charge him interest, or you charge him a low interest rate. Obviously, you've got to take that in consideration for fringe benefit purposes. So that'll just give you some ideas on what to do. And again, there's no tax implications if the loan is for bona fide study purposes. Okay, again, within reason. And then the aggregate loans don't exceed 3,000 in any one particular year. So again, if you're an organization that provides loans to employees, you need to keep an eye out for this. And then this is just I've just put in a table of the most recent changes. And we're now sitting on 8.5, but this is interesting. Do you remember in the COVID years when we were right down to 4.5%? So, I mean, these increases and decreases, in a sense, have good and bad connotations. And the first one is obviously a decrease is good for those that have got debt, okay, but it's not so good for those that have got savings. So for pensioners, for instance, they get hit the hardest when these sort of interest rates actually change. So keep an eye on this one. Just make sure that you're in line, because again, I know that these things are changing probably every couple of months, whenever the guys sit together and figure out what they should do, whether they should go up or down. But bear in mind that when there's a change, it's effective from the first of the following month of the announcement. So we find that a lot of companies, as soon as the announcement is made, they change their payroll for that month. You don't change it for that month, you change it for the month thereafter. Otherwise, you might be, the employee either gets a benefit that he shouldn't get. And again, SARS will pick these things up if they're doing an audit. All right, so let's now just have a look at the Section 11A refund. Again, so what I mentioned just now is they're looking at a new code. So this new code on the RP5 is code 4042. There's 2 additional codes that they're looking at adding in. Now, they haven't finalized this just yet. I know we're at the start of a new tax year, but they're saying this will only really come into effect from the mid-year submission. So payroll companies are still looking at this. They will get some finality from SARS soon. And then once the finality is there and it's all been signed off, the payroll provider obviously will put this into the actual system. So this is, let's take an example of a guy that gets this bone. I'll go back to the amount that I mentioned earlier on. So the individual then is expected to pay this back in full. And then claim it back at the end of the tax year. And the reason for that is because SARS says, well, if we as SARS are going to pay you back 450,000, we want to make sure that you don't owe us any money, or there's no outstanding penalties or admin fees or whatever it may be. Because when we pay you this money back, we want to be able to deduct this first. But on the flip side, we've now got an individual that's now out of pocket the 450,000. He hasn't seen that. He hasn't had the use of it. SARS has got it. That's a lot of money. And again, it causes so many cash flow issues with individuals. So what tends to happen is payroll departments try and do the best they can, and I put that in inverted commas, to assist that individual, as long as there is good reason to, and that the relationship between the employer and that individual has not been soured. So in cases of things like bursaries, there might be a genuine reason why the person couldn't finish the bursary and he's got to pay it back, or there's maternity leave or whatever, those sort of things have been paid up front and there's got to be a payback. But for someone that's received a sign-on bonus and that thing now goes, the whole relationship goes sour, obviously the employer is going to say, in most instances, well, tough, it's your problem, you've got to pay us the money back, you claim it back from SARS. And as I say, this is something that SARS is looking at, saying, well, is there not a way that we can assist those individuals? Because again, SARS doesn't like to pay back a lot of money at tax year end. Okay, they'd rather everything get trued up throughout the course of the tax year. And again, that's one of the purposes of the on the cards project of the monthly tax returns. Okay, so let's take an example. So here's an individual, okay, who's got his R1,000,000. He's paid over to SARS the 450, and the employee has taken the 550 home. He now has to be refunded this R1,000,000, and often this doesn't get recorded on an RP5. It's a sort of an out of the payroll or off payroll type transaction. So in this case, the employee received this, so he's got to pay it back. And the employee's also got to pay back this money. And again, he can only get this currently back via on assessment. And the idea now is to somehow pay this back via payroll, but it's not as easy as it looks. So if I just move on to this, so here's a spreadsheet that we put together just to kind of show you what the net effect of this is. So let's take March. So in March, this guy, for whatever reasons, it's his first month with the company, he gets paid a basic of 350,000 for the month. He gets his bonus. So his total earnings for the month is the 1.35 million. Okay. You can see, if you just go further down, you can see what his annualized earnings are. You can see he's on the 45% tax rate. You can see what his annualized tax is going to be, and you can see what the bonus tax is, which is the 450. And you can see for that month, the total amount of tax paid by that individual is the 593,000. Okay, and there you can see his net at the bottom. Now in month 2, okay, he's now going to pay this money back. So you can see in April, his earnings have now gone down, and I'm assuming that the employee is still with the same employer. Let's assume that whatever happened here, they amicably solved the issue and he's still with that employer. So in that instance, his earnings are 160,000. There's his million that he's got to pay back. So he's now got negative earnings of 840,000. So obviously, if there's negative earnings, there's going to be a negative tax calculation. But as you all know, SARS does not allow you to give money back to an employee. Okay, so you can't put negative tax on a payslip, and SARS is saying this is our money. You can't just give it back to the employee without permission. So SARS does get very picky and sticky about those sort of things. So there you can see in April now, it wants to give the individual this money back. But because we can't have a negative, what it now does is it zeroizes the tax. So as you can see there for April, May, okay, have a look at near the bottom there where it says monthly PAYE on the payslip. Those are all zero amounts, okay, until such time as he now gets into a situation where this amount of tax has been paid back, and we're now into a normal tax scenario. So if you look in October, okay, that was also a month in which there is no tax. But as soon as we go into November, that tax has now been paid back, or whatever little is left is offset against the tax for that month. So in the November month, he only pays 10,000 odd, but then in the December month, we're now back to normal tax on the 160,000. So this is just a scenario that SARS is looking at and saying, well, how do we resolve this? So in this example that I've given you now, at the end of the tax year, all of that tax has now been paid back to that employee. So in theory, SARS doesn't really even know that this transaction took place. So if there was an amount owed to that individual, SARS now hasn't got the opportunity to deduct any outstanding penalties and tax off the 450,000 before it was paid back to the employee. So again, this sort of scenario, in theory, it's good that SARS wants to do this, but in practice, we're still trying to figure out how this is actually going to work. So they've put through the legislation to deal with this, but again, how it plays out on the RP5 and how it plays out in terms of negative tax is still under debate or under scrutiny at the moment. So only at that point, which is in November, is PAYE back to a positive value. And of course, if this now ends up By the end of the tax year, he still hasn't had the full 450,000. So let's assume that this employee wasn't earning 160,000, he was earning half of that. Obviously, by the end of the tax year, the tax credit that he's due, i.e. the 450, would never have been paid back. So at that point, because we're now going into a new tax year, when he does his assessment, he's got to provide all of this information, plus he then puts in the claim for the balance of outstanding tax. So it does get a little bit complicated. And as I say, what SARS is doing is, I think this is another one of those initiatives that SARS is trying to put in place to force us from a payroll perspective to get our affairs right on a month-by-month basis, rather than only get it right by the end of the tax year. And I think this is also pretty much in preparation for when SARS starts to start to accept the monthly submission of tax returns. Okay, so again, the bottom line is the implications. There's no tax for a couple of months. In this case, COIDA obviously needs to be adjusted, because if you don't, you're going to end up with a situation where you've now got an extra R1 million sitting in your COIDA calculation that you're going to end up paying levies on. So again, this has to be adjusted. And then the other thing is, which is a problem, is when you pay the R1 million, obviously it's deemed as remuneration, so there is UIF and SDL, etc. on this. When it gets paid back to the employer, it's not seen as remuneration, so the employer is not going to get the UIF and the SDL back. Okay, so this is another potential issue that needs to be looked at. Okay, so again, keep an eye out for this. So if in your organization you do have these kind of refund scenarios, it is going to change over the next couple of months, and you are going to, number one, probably have to change payroll processes internally as to how you're going to deal with this. And obviously, you're going to have to be careful as to how you handle these calculations on the actual pay slip, i.e. when you do the calculation of the payroll every month. Okay. Okay, and just remember there is a difference between a payroll admin error and reneging on a contract. Okay, because it does happen that you overpay somebody and then the following month you claw it back. Now, you might have overpaid someone in commission, and the following month but it's not a big amount like the R1 million as an example. So that's deemed as a normal payroll admin error, which can be sorted out quite easily by reducing earnings for the month and giving back some tax, as long as you don't get back to a negative. So obviously the receiver will look at it from two different perspectives. So there's a interpretation notice number 88 that's gone out that you do need to have a look at. It deals with this. It gives you a lot of examples. It covers restraint of trade payments as well. So please, if you're in a business which deals with these or has these sort of scenarios, please keep an eye out for this, because it's not as easy as it looks. Okay, the duplicate tax reference numbers. So what's going to happen over here is SARS are trying to get rid of this issue that foreigners or asylum seekers or refugees that become proper residents of South Africa and get a proper ID number, a South African ID number. They're trying to get around these issues that they're having with the previous tax number being issued with a penalty because a return hasn't been submitted. So they're trying to get around all this. So they're putting some more questions on the IT Reg facility, which I'll show you just now. Okay, so they're going to start asking things like your country of birth and your previous ID, if you've got it, and did you previously have a tax reference number? Now, the interesting thing about this is if you use the IT Reg process on EasyFile and you load up an employee that you want a reference number for, EasyFile now is going to have to change to provide these sort of questions, and you're going to have to give them the relevant answers. That's the first thing. If you take this employee onto your payroll and your payroll feeds this information back into EasyFile, these kind of questions have now got to be asked within the payroll at employee take on time. So this obviously doesn't affect existing employees because they've all probably got the numbers, but it certainly is going to impact new employees coming into the company. You're going to have to ask these sort of questions. So again, you'll see this, there'll be an official notice that comes out from SARS around this, but it's already in. For those of you that like to read technical documents, the SARS Business Requirement Spec, the BRS, okay, that's just been released. So it's a simple document. It's only about 250 pages. And if you've got the appetite to read through it, all of this is actually discussed in there. All right, retirement pot or the new retirement system, just very briefly. I don't want to spend too much time on this because it's pretty much old hat already. But remember that from September, we have 3 pots. We have your vested pot, which is everything that you invested prior to September. And then we have the savings pot, which is the new amount that gets saved every month, the 1/3. And then we have the retirement pot, which is the 2/3 that you can't touch, like the old system, until you actually retire. So you've, as I said, a vested pot. All the same rules still apply. It's prohibited. Access to this is prohibited until retirement age, and it's subject to the normal retirement withdrawal table, where you've got the first 550,000 tax-free, etc. And of course, this depends on whether or not you've already used some of that 550. So if you've had a retrenchment package and you've taken the retrenchment package and you've offset it against this, remember, SARS has a long memory. Your 550 now could be reduced to 350 as an example. So just bear that in mind. Again, the vested pot stays exactly as is. It pays out exactly as is. The only difference here is when the new system came in, they took 10% of that, up to 30,000 maximum, for each fund that you belong to, and they moved that into your new savings pot so you could withdraw this amount. Okay, so the savings pot itself, the 1/3 goes in there. And it starts off with 10% of 30,000 for each fund that you have, and your first month's contribution, i.e. your September contribution, 1/3 of that goes into this pot. And you've got access to this once a year. All right, so you can only pull this money out once a tax year. You can't take it out more. So you can't say, well, I only want 5,000 now, but 6 months down the road, you decide you needed actually more of that. And then you can and then apply again. It doesn't happen. You can only do it once a year. And you have to take out more than 2,000. The minimum amount is 2,000. There's no maximum. So whatever's in that savings pot, you can withdraw the whole amount if you want, again, per fund. All right. The downside to this is a lot of individuals didn't fully understand what the tax implications were going to be. So they requested 10,000 and many of them only got half of that back. So by the time the tax was applied and SARS took their piece, a lot of those individuals were actually short of what they were hoping to get. And obviously, again, wanted to apply for additional funding, but you've had your chance once a tax year, so you can only do it again this tax year. So basically, what's happening is the industry is expecting again now, March and April, a lot of requests again to withdraw. But remember that this time, if you've taken everything out of the pot last year, you only have access to 1/3 of your contribution. So it's a very small amount. So again, employees are going to have to be educated, on how this whole thing actually works. And then remember the new retirement pot. Again, you're only allowed access to this on retirement. And depending on how it's actually paid out, it's obviously subject to normal tax. You can roll over the excessive contribution. So all of those traditional functions and facilities that used to exist are still there. All right, this was just a reminder of the withdrawal tables. So again, in 2022, 23, just I think the year after that, it was increased, okay, to the 550. Okay, so they upped it by 50,000. They only look at this once every 8 to 10 years. So they've now upped it to 550,000. So they probably will only get to looking at this again in a couple of years' time. But anyway, that's the table on the right-hand side that we now adhere to when we withdraw. And that's the tax that we pay on the lump sum payment that we get when we retire from the fund. Okay, and this is also for early withdrawals from funds. There's that table. Okay, so what happens in September around the two-pot system? So number one, we had 2.5 million applications. All right, so 200,000 weren't approved due to wrong IDs provided, or they weren't registered for tax. There was a whole number of reasons. There was another 200,000 that underestimated the income. They obviously wanted to lower their marginal rate, so they told SARS that they only earned 100,000. Meantime, they earned a million when you take all the other income into consideration. So SARS has started the process of penalizing these individuals. Remember, in tax law, it says if you lie to SARS, that's a naughty thing to do, and they can penalize you for that. So this is the process that's happening in the background at the moment. The largest percentage of applicants were in the 60 to 119,000 bracket per annum. So as you can see, we're pretty much the lower end of the market. And the second largest were those in the 240 to 359 bracket. And then age-related, 75% of applicants were in the age group 31 to 51. So it's interesting just to see the dynamics. So the older folk who are closing in on retirement obviously realize that to take money out is going to cost them an enormous amount of money. So they didn't take it out. They kind of said, well, let's wait to retirement. Interesting enough, almost a quarter of the claimants are from the wholesale and retail sector. That's clothing, food, appliances, etc. So that was quite interesting. And then of the 45 billion paid out, the average payout was 19,000 Rand. So it's not a huge amount of money. Of course, it was a big win for SARS, and they collected about 12 billion from this initiative. So obviously it added to that 12% so-called increase in personal taxes that they collected. So basically 25% of the money went back to SARS. Now imagine if we didn't put this two-pot system in place, how SARS would be, how the budget speech would have struggled in terms of SARS, because now SARS would have been another 12 billion short. All right, so what they managed to do was obviously clear a massive backlog of all those outstanding AA88s that a lot of you, I'm sure, have come across in recent years. Okay, so the money was again used to pay off some debt, okay, which sadly happened. 70% of people plan to claim again. So again, you're going to have lots of queries from employees this year, okay, about how to go about doing this, because as I say, 70% plan to claim again. 86% were happy with their decision. Great. 96 know that their withdrawal is going to impact their life. I think there was a survey done on about 8,000 people. So this is reasonably accurate. And then, of course, 96% were aware that they're going to be taxed on the amount. They are now aware. But interesting enough, when we looked at the statistics just straight after this, a large percentage of people, can you believe it, didn't think that they were going to get taxed. So for most individuals, their current financial needs outweighed the benefits of long-term savings for retirement. Okay, so we seem to have created a very short-term solution, which is really, it's going to rear its head again over this coming year. So, you know, if you're in the payroll space, please watch out for this, because employees are going to be quizzing you about this. Okay, in terms of the cost, 357,000. There was even one institution that was charging as high as 1,500 Rand to do this transaction. Okay, 7,700 employers deducted the contribution but didn't pay it over to SARS. So this impacted about 300,000 individuals. I mean, that's a massive amount. And as I say, 35% said they withdraw again in the next round. That's from now. And again, combinations, volumes, verification processes, etc. And there was 850 funds in South Africa that had to change, and they all had to submit their rules. And the vast majority, obviously, this was on time. There was one or two that didn't get their rules through in September, so their fund members could only go through the claims process in November, December this year. So it's interesting to see what's happened with this two-pot system. The big downside, okay, was that so many said that they withdrew too little. They didn't realize that they're going to pay a fee to do this. They're going to pay tax on it, and SARS is going to take whatever SARS is due. So a lot of them only got out of this half of what they expected to. You know, as I say, again, they didn't take advice. They just assumed if I apply for my 10,000, I'm going to get it. Okay, and then we'll see what happens over the next 2 months. But it's interesting to see how this is all played out. And obviously, all these withdrawals now will appear on the auto-assess process. Because remember, you've got a directive. So in terms of SARS, it's additional taxable income. So the moment you've got additional taxable income, in theory, you should become a provisional taxpayer. And in theory, you're going to get, let's call it an R35 and an RT3A. And in theory, the auto-assessment process is now going to not work because it sees multiple sources of income. So I'm interested to see how this is now going to play out, particularly given that the majority of people that withdrew from those funds are at the lower end of the earnings scale and have never had to worry about doing a tax return. Okay, so now if auto-assess pops up and says, well, we've now got multiple returns for you, we now expect you to do a tax assessment. That's going to open up a whole new can of worms. Okay, the upside, of course, is, you know, despite all the pain, there are most taxpayers out there are obviously a lot more educated in terms of how this process actually works. So that's a good thing. And individuals can access a portion of their retirement savings now without having to resign. That was a horrible, horrible situation where people had to leave their organizations because they were so desperate for money. They had to leave to be able to withdraw all of their money. So we're still in the process of, as we should do, enforcing people to save for their retirement. Okay, AA88s, just very quickly. This is has been an issue, a long outstanding issue, and I'm sure all of you pull your hair out when you see these AA88s because you're now just suddenly faced with an AA88, or the employee comes to you and says to you, you won't believe it, but SARS took out all this money from my bank account. And we don't even know why. So AA88s, it's a legal tool used by SARS to recover outstanding tax from you. If they can't get the money directly from the bank or wherever, obviously you as the employer are obliged to collect this on behalf of SARS. So again, AA88s is something that's going to live with us for a while still, although a massive backlog has actually been cleared. So hopefully it's not going to be too bad in the coming year or two. But as we all know, we're going to have these individuals getting themselves into problems with SARS again, and I'm sure 88 is going to rear its head again soon. Okay, the SARS debt recovery process, in terms of how they do that, I'm not going to go through that. Managing your AA88s on EasyFile, there's just a reminder of the different transaction status codes. So if you need any further information about that, you can just pop us an email and we can explain it in a bit more detail. Very important, if an active notice reaches its end of date, it's no longer applicable, even if the transaction code is 02. You know, what often happens is you look on the dashboard and you see all of these AA88s, and often you don't realize that a lot of, or a vast number of them, have actually either reached their end of date or they've actually been resolved. So we've asked SARS to try and clean up that a little bit better to make it kind of a little bit more easy on the eye. When you look at this information, you don't suddenly get the shock to think, wow, there's all these AA88s that I've got to deal with, when in fact a lot of them are already null and void. Okay, and again, you must regularly sync with EasyFile for all the latest updates. Whenever we deal with SARS, one of the things they always tell us to do is to encourage our users to update EasyFile as regularly as possible. So again, if these are not resolved timelessly, we go into what feels like a never-ending spiral or a cycle. Even worse, the employer will ultimately be held liable. And then the last thing I want to just chat to you about are these auto assessments. Again, auto assessments is something that SARS has put in place to assist them in not having to do laborious, time-consuming manual assessments, which really just take up a lot of time and energy, when in fact a lot of individuals in South Africa have got a very, very simple remuneration structure or income structure, and all of these can be done automatically using their AI tools. So all I want to say about this is that auto assessments is here to stay. They are getting more and more sophisticated about this. So in theory, us as employers are going to have to do less work on this. Employees are going to have to do less engaging with SARS, hopefully. And hopefully we end up in a situation where, like in many countries around the world, there are very, very few individuals in those countries who have to engage with the tax authorities, because everything is automated. All the information from third parties is provided electronically into central government, and all of these are trued up. Again, your obligations to the taxing authorities is basically consolidated, and it's reconciled on a monthly basis. So the last thing I just want to mention about the monthly tax returns that SARS have been talking about for a while. So the idea was that from this year, we'd start testing the concept of this, and all the payroll companies were given some specs on what to do and how to do it. And the majority of payroll companies have in some way or other already built this into the back end of their systems. It's just a case of switching it on. But nobody can switch it on because there's a couple of things that we still have to deal with SARS. And given what happened with elections last year, given what happened with the Government of National Unity, a lot of initiatives that were happening within SARS and Treasury, for that matter, were pretty much put on hold for various reasons. And one of the things that was put on hold was this monthly tax returns. So we are not going to be forced to do this anytime soon. So we are still trying to convince SARS to finish the specs and at least let the payroll companies test and just get their heads around how this is all going to work, so that when they do dump this on us, we are ready for it. But this is one of those things that is going to take a year of parallel running between the old way of doing things and the new way of doing things. So we've already had official notification of SARS that September and March, the introduction in March next year, is off the table. But there's still ongoing discussion and debate about it. But who knows when that's going to happen. But believe me, it's going to be quite a significant event in all of our lives, because your systems will be able to cater for it. That's easy. But internally, what you do from a business process point of view, that's what's going to be impacted the most. Okay, so that was just a little bit about budget, a little bit about what's happening with SARS. I could spend the rest of the day telling you so many other things, but we really just don't have the time for that.
So yeah, I suppose those people have got meetings to get to as well.
Yes, yeah. So I hope you've enjoyed this morning, and I hope that you have found it interesting. And again, as Donovan said, if you've got any questions, we've got some time now, so we can deal with a few. If you want me to talk about something else, just let us know. And if you've missed anything, don't worry, you're going to get a copy of this PowerPoint presentation. And also, if you think after the session this morning that, gee, I should have asked that question, just pop it on email to Donovan, and we'll get to it at some point. All right. So once again, for everybody out there, thank you for listening to me for the last 2 hours. Donovan, over to you.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, thank you very much, everyone. So yeah, I will send all of this stuff through to you guys. At the top of your page, Q&A button. If there are any questions, you want to hang around and see that, you are welcome to. We'll probably keep this channel open then until 11:30, and then I will end the event. If you do leave now, I'll also copy the questions that are sent through, so I'll send those through to you as well. But otherwise, yeah, thank you very much, guys, and have a wonderful day. See you on the next one. Okay, question from Gloria. Could you please explain the subsistence allowance as to who qualifies? And is there a threshold on the car allowance based on earnings of an employee? Have you got the question in front of you, Rob?
Okay, Jean, you are our resident expert, so I'm going to throw it over to you.
Thank you, Rob. Okay, so the first question is subsistence allowance as to who qualifies. So it depends on which type of subsistence it is. If it is an overnight subsistence, the employee needs to spend one night, at least one night, away from his residential place where he lives. And he obviously needs to have the employer needs to give him instruction to be away. If it is a daily subsistence, that is not an actual subsistence. If you read the wording that SARS has given, it's a reimbursement. And with that reimbursement, the employee needs to adhere to certain rules. First of all, the employee needs to give them instruction. Number two, they need to be away from the office. And number three, and this is something that a lot of employers don't really actually know, is that the employee needs to submit proof of that expense. And that expense must be then capped at the value which SARS then states of the daily allowance. Okay, so those are the rules around the subsistence allowance. Your next question, is there a threshold on the car allowance based on earnings of an employee? So no, there is no threshold on the car allowance. There is a calculation on the value that you can set to a car allowance or a travel allowance. What I'll do is I will share with you a tax bite which highlights or sets out very nicely for you how to calculate this travel allowance. That allowance then looks at what is your vehicle's value, determined value, how many kilometers that employee will be traveling for the year. How many of those kilometers will be travel and private, and then also which kind of cost is borne by the employee or by the employer. So all of those things need to be taken into consideration before you put an allowance on a car or a travel allowance. And then your last question is, if you could please explain impact of loans to employees. Okay, so the impact of loans to employees, excuse me, the impact of loans to employees, if an employee receives a loan and you are not putting a interest component on that loan, that employee receives a fringe benefit in the sense of, if an employee went to a bank to go and get a loan, let's say the loan was 8,000, a bank or a financial institution would have charged them some interest on that loan. Now, when the employer gives a loan to an employee without an interest component, they're getting a benefit from this. And SARS says because they're getting this benefit, they need to pay tax on that benefit. So SARS issues a interest rate every year. I think, Rob, correct me if I'm wrong, it's 8.5%.
Yeah, it's 8.5. Yeah.
Yes. So what you then do is you work out the 8.5% interest component on that loan, and because an employee is not paying that interest, that portion of that interest becomes a fringe benefit, and tax will be paid on top of that fringe benefit portion. If the employer do, however, ask the employee to pay interest, but let's say at a 4% rate, then you take the difference between the SARS rate, which is 8.5%, and the employee rate, which is now 4%. And that 4.5% difference is still a benefit that the employee is getting, because at any other financial institution, he would have paid a full percentage of 8.5 on interest. So there's still a fringe benefit portion on that low interest loan, if that answers your question.
Thanks, John. Donovan, anything else that you want us to deal with?
No, nothing yet. So we'll give it a little bit.
Okay, so if I can just close on something. Okay, what we've also done is, let me just get back to this presentation so you can see.
There is one more when you're ready, Rob.
Okay, well, let's deal with that one then.
Do you have any further information about foreign pensions earned by SA residents being possibly taxed going forward?
Yes, we do. So it's actually included in this PowerPoint presentation. There's a lot more detail after what I've just stopped on now. So if you read through that, as I say, there'll be some more information that you can look at. All right. I just wanted to very quickly, I don't want to go through any great detail, but what I've also added into this document is a little bit about interpretation notices that are specific to the payroll world. Okay, so I've listed them all. The ones that are in red, those are the ones that have been bubbling under over the last couple of years, and those are the ones that you should really have a look at if you're doing these kind of things in your payroll. Okay, so it's restraint of trade payments, employer provided phones, and that sort of thing. So have a look at those. And as I said, the red ones are the ones that you need to read through. They will give you some very useful information about other things that happens from a tax perspective with an employee. And then the last one, which is, I have two favorite ones, and the one is 84, which is your tax and VAT on gains. So for those of you that make a living out of betting, remember that at some point you need to tell SARS about the money that you've made, and then the money that you get from that gambling machine gets split. SARS takes its piece, and then you take your piece. And that's the one. And the other one that never seems to stop amazing me is there is an interpretation notice that deals with money gained illicitly. So if you've stolen money from your employer or you've stolen money from anybody, SARS would like you to declare that and pay the tax on it. And there is an interpretation notice that actually deals with that. Can you believe it? And then what I've also done is I want to just remind you about hijacking on e-filing. Be careful about that. There's a lot of that going on at the moment. These are just some codes for the IRP5. But here is something that I do want you to be very careful of, and it's all about SARS and their AI and their chatbots and that sort of thing. So when you go to the SARS website, there is a little button on the website that says Ask the AI Assistant. And when you click on that, it brings up a thing that says, how can I help you? And then you can put in a question like we've put in there, what RP5 code is used for restraint of trade? And then what it does, it comes back, goes to all the SARS documents, and it comes back and it gives you some information. Now, what we did was we tested a couple of these tools. So we looked at ChatGPT, we looked at DeepSeek, we looked at SARS, we looked at Grok, which is the new Elon Musk one, and we pretty much asked them all the same question. The red is where it came back with a question that we don't believe is correct or is really, really incorrect. And the blue is where it came back with a good answer, which we kind of reckon is safe to go with. But remember, you're dealing with people's money, you're dealing with tax, you're dealing with compliance. And if you use these chatbots or these AI tools to answer any question around income tax, please be careful. Right now, all of this is in its infancy. They do come back with different answers because remember, every day something changes. I just want to caution you that this is new technology. You do need to double check your answers. So right now, don't take for granted that the answer that you're getting is 100% correct. So until these tools have been absolutely proven and are foolproof, AI is great, but you need to be very careful. Jean, you've been doing a lot of work around this for us. What's your view?
Yes, Rob, so sorry, I just want to add something to this. People actually don't take into consideration when they ask chatbots questions. Sash has recently, and I mean recently in the last, I think it was 2 years ago, where they issued that thing where they said that if someone does a neglectful or willful incorrect submission or whatever it might be, you can be held liable. And this is very important to bear in mind when you use tools such as AI chatbots, because the burden of proof will be on you to show that you were not neglectful. So by checking your answer, you're covering your all sides with getting the right information out.
Be very careful about this. Okay, there's a lot of companies out there that are providing these sort of tools. You can be almost, well, when I say guaranteed, you can be rest assured that if it's a company that you're working with that's only looking at their data. So if I've got 100 documents and my AI tool only looks through the 100 documents, I know that the information that's going to come back for you is going to be correct. But if I ask that same question and that tool goes and looks at documents all over the internet, okay, it can get confused and it can come back with contradictory information. So again, we are, from a payroll perspective and a tax perspective, we are heading down this road very, very quickly. But these tools are still very new, very young, and still need to learn a lot. So again, please just be careful about using them. Anything else, guys?
No, I think that's it. I think we're safe. If there's anything else, please feel free to email us. And yeah, we'll take it from there. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Thank you, everybody. I look forward to chatting to you again sometime. Cheerio.
Perfect. Thanks, Rob. Thanks, John. Cheers, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.